Okay. Can you hear me all the way to the back? Okay, fantastic. So a little bit about, can we get these lights down, please? Yeah, thank you. So a little bit about ZENDRIVE. ZENDRIVE, as Professor mentioned, it's a company that is committed to making roads safer, and we do that by understanding driving behaviors and coaching drivers to become safer. Just a quick snapshot of where we are. We have been in existence for 5 years. In terms of data, we are the largest such platform out there. Analyzed 60 million users, 160 billion miles of driving. Have seen data from 10 plus countries at this point in time, very wide scoped. And sort of, our impact primarily has been that in several situations, whether those are related to insurance, whether those are related to family safety, roadside assistance, we have been able to make people safer and save lives on the road, literally. So with that, a little bit of a context. Let's get started about why this problem is important to begin with. Right? So this is a number that not many people know or remember, and actually when I saw that number for the first time, I was shocked. Right? 1.3 million people lose their lives every year, and this has been true for last several years. Not many things kill that many people. You think about diseases like maybe cardiac diseases, cancer, and so on. Maybe those are higher, but beyond that, sort of very quickly run into these. And this is really amongst the first man-made disasters that is causing sort of such a large casualties. More importantly, the problem is not getting better; it's actually getting worse. If you look at the data for sort of last several decades for number of collisions per billion miles driven, it actually turns out that it was going down until about 2010 because simple reasons: cars were getting better, seat belts became mandatory, speed limits were rationalized, airbags became pretty much standard. So good things were happening. And starting 2010, if you look, the numbers are actually going up. And the reason is all of us carry this device in our pocket, and it is really one of the most distracting devices ever created. We can't even keep that away from our pockets when we are driving. Right? This is not a uncommon thing. This is one of the most common things all of us end up doing. In fact, just day before, ZENDRIVE published a study which we do on a yearly basis talking about distracted driving. And our data actually suggested that the problem, this alone problem, it's just getting worse and worse every year. The amount of distraction is now sort of comparable to drunk driving, and in many cases the distracted drivers are actually seen as a bigger menace on the road than the drunk drivers. So I would certainly encourage you guys to check it out. It's there on several news and media websites already. So basically, sort of that's sort of what we do. We analyze data. Now, where does this data for us for analysis comes from? It comes from smartphones. So that's the sort of interesting thing, that the device that is at the forefront of leading cause for this problem is the device that we are leveraging to understand, to begin with, what the problem is. Right? We use smartphone sensors. Smartphones are amazing devices. They have all kinds of interesting capabilities, whether you want to know location using GPS, accelerometers, gyroscopes, magnetometers, you name it, barometers. And so we use all the possible sensors on the device to actually understand, so long as the phone is in the car. And it's impossible to find a car on the road anywhere on the world today that does not have a smartphone inside it already. So now sort of problem shifts from having a hardware to collect data to just saying, hey, how do I get my software on the mobile phone that's in the car? And that's basically sort of what we do. But we don't just stop at collecting data and understanding behavior. We actually build systems to coach drivers to make them safer, better over time. And it's driven from very actionable insights that we derive from their own data, talking about, hey, this is how much phone use you are having. This is where you were driving really aggressively, or this is where you were not following the rules of the road. You were going well above speed limits and so on. So all of these kinds of interesting insights and information that we provide to the drivers and to our customers. And we are a platform that is embedded into large number of applications. And like I mentioned earlier, the applications range from insurance to family safety, roadside assistance, and fleets themselves. But given that this is a research audience, I will actually talk a little bit about a specific problem. And this problem is about detecting collisions. No matter how much you try to drive people to become safer, collisions are still inevitable, which they are going to happen, maybe at a reduced frequency. And there is a possibility of saving lives when a collision has actually happened, provided you can detect it in time and get the emergency response to that individual within time, so you can actually save lives. Right? So this is an insight we had a few years ago as we started on this journey, and we started off with thinking about, hey, just by using smartphone and smartphone sensors, can we figure out if somebody is involved in a collision, and then can we get them help immediately, right? So that was the genesis, and what I'm going to talk in the rest of the slides is about the journey of building something like this, and sort of, what does it take? So it's going to be a combination of sort of, thinking about business, thinking about technology, and all of that. So let's begin. Let's start from sort of, if you think about this problem and you say, this is what I want to do, what are the kinds of challenges that someone is going to run into when they think about this, right? And there is nothing non-obvious here. First thing first, phone is not tethered to the car, which means phone is going to fall much more often or slide off much more often than your car is going to hit something else. So the number of false positives that you are going to see is going to be a heck of a lot more, right? That's applicable to pretty much everything that we do. So we are sort of already used to that, but in collisions, this becomes an important factor. A collision event is almost an instantaneous event. It lasts for less than 50 milliseconds. You won't see anything else sort of, before or after that. Which means you are going to capture data at a very, very high granularity, at a very high frequency, in order to ascertain whether whatever you observed on some of these sensors is actually a collision or not. Which means you need to deal with large, you need to process data at a very high rate that has an impact on battery and CPU and all of those things that we hold dear on our mobile phone. We don't want our batteries to run dry at 4 p.m. Right? Should work on thousands of different phone models, right? I mean, if we just do a survey within this room, there will be probably 20 different types of phones that we will be carrying. Today at ZENDRIVE, because of the massive 60 million users worth of data that we have seen 15, 20,000 different phones out there in the market, different make models that are there. And really sort of, when you think about solving problem, you are looking at, it should work on all of those phones literally. How do you get it to do that? How do you test, evaluate, those become more important real problems to begin with. Collisions are very, very rare. They are literally the black swan events, right? If you look at a country like US, where the data is cleanly available, a collision occurs roughly every 500,000 miles. Which means if you observe people for driving and just looked at when they have collisions, you will almost never find them, right? It's just that you see them because there are lots of people driving lots of times, and then you see one collision. But if you look at it for an individual's driving, you will almost never find it. So they are extremely rare events. That makes the problem really, really hard, because there are lots of confounding factors that you need to deal with, and the event that you are truly interested in is very, very rare. But at the same time, the impact is very, very high, right? The collision, when it happens, is a very emotional event, people are in distress, and you really want to help them at that point in time. It creates amazing business, it creates great brand value and all of those things. So the problem is interesting to solve. And finally, this is the starting problem. Most people face this problem when they start looking at a new challenge. There is no data that exactly fits your requirements. And that's true of this case. When we started, we had no data. Because the collisions are so rare, even if you have some data coming from some users, you are hardly ever going to find any. So with all of these challenges, how do you actually start building something like this? So it all has to start with acquiring data. That's the first thing, and this is where sort of the reality of sort of running a business, running a startup, it's the thing that you're not going to find data in sort of open source or sort of web repositories, but you really have to go out and collect this data. And that's what we did. We built strategic partnerships with car OEMs. Why car OEMs? Because guess what? They do crash detection tests anyway. They go and crash cars because they want to know whether the airbags will deploy or not, whether seat belts will work or not, whether crumple zones are sufficient or not. And so we basically worked with BMW and we said, hey, why don't, when you go and crash cars, can you put our phones in your cars and just crash them? And we will collect a bunch of data and that will be valuable to us. Of course, BMW is an investor that helped. But that's how we got our very initial data set. We collected 300 different collisions. And mind you, this collection took several months because you are not crashing cars on a daily basis, maybe twice a week, and then you are getting few data points from there. So collecting a large enough data set could run into months literally. But we did that. It's a 100 hertz data set. So every sensor is being collected at 100 hertz, and the real data of interest is just 100 milliseconds, 200 milliseconds, but you want to capture bigger. So, but even if you say 50 seconds, it's not a crazily large amount of data, just with this volume of sort of collisions. But that's your start. That's what you get, and you have to start from somewhere and then start building things, right? So we did that, and then we said, okay, now we have some data which tells us what does a collision sense like on a smartphone when it actually happens. But what about the 99.999% of driving where all other kinds of things happen? Are they going to feel in any way similar to this? In the other way, sort of, how are we going to think for false positives? And that's where we basically went crazy with all kinds of sort of, innovative things to figure out what could feel like a collision. What if you drop your phone? What if you drop your phone inside the car? What if you drop it outside the car? What if your phone just slides and hits something? We collected lots and lots of data around that. In those days, if you had gone to Budigere Cross, you would have seen a bunch of us driving around like maniacs, just collecting data. Bumper cars, we found a cheap way of sort of, seeing if you just keep hitting things and sort of, what kind of impulses, what kind of responses you will see. Not ideal, but gets the job done. Let's start from there, right? So we literally went to Fun World and other places and played with cars and pasting phones to those cars and crashing them and seeing what does it feel like. We created simulated cars in some cases and tried with those things as well. And then obviously rash maneuvers. Try to apply a hard brake, try to apply, get the car into sort of some kind of a tailspin and see what happens. So all those kinds of interesting things. Build the initial data set, and then you start building your minimum viable product, something that you can hand to a customer and say, would you please try this? This should work. And obviously a lot of interesting things here. False positives, as I talked about, become really important. Something I talked about earlier, that phones stumble a lot more often than cars crash, which means if you look at just accelerometer impulses, you would be wrong almost always. Very few times you would actually find a collision. So we started building models to begin with. We looked at the problem as three phase. What are the car dynamics like before the collision? What's happening right before? What speed the person is traveling at, and what kind of roads, and so on and so forth. What happens right at the impact, and then what is happening immediately after the impact in few minutes that pass by. And once you start combining these things, and a lot of human intuition also goes into this, so lots of heuristics, you start building an inference engine to say, this is what a collision looks like, this is a collision, this is what does not look like a collision. So essentially it's a combination of building few machine learning models for low level features around impulses, around speed drops and other things, but a lot of human ingenuity going in to build this. And finally tying all of this together with a voting model that looks at all of these different features and votes them together and says, this is what we have. And then the fun part of this all begins. So I'll probably just let you guys read this quickly. But that's really what selling an MVP is like, right? So we went through that phase, succeeded in selling our brick, and got it users to deploy. And this is where the loop of this startup really begins. You are launching and iterating at a rapid pace. You are constantly learning from the data that you are collecting. You are making modifications, you are shipping it out. Every so often there is a improvement that your customers, that your users can see, and you run this loop a few times over, and you start seeing a product that's starting to take shape. Right? So these are some of the things that we ended up doing. First, collect enormous amount of data. One of the biggest things that we pride ourselves is the data repository that we have built with millions of users, because there is so much diversity in phones, so much diversity in driving behaviors and so on, that you need that volume of data to make these kind of inferences. But for collisions, unless you have several billion miles of data, you have not seen many collisions, because one occurs every 500,000 miles. So if you have a billion miles of data and you have detected every single collision, you have probably 2,000 of them. Still a small set, right? So that was the first important thing that we did. User feedback. You obviously want to get labeled data. Right? It's not just enough to have sensor data. You want to know whether this was a collision. What type of collision was it? Was it a multi-car collision? Did the person tumble, or did the car tumble? Did it happen as a head-on collision or a sideway or whatnot? And so we worked with our customers to build in direct feedback, where thousands of users upon collision detection actually provided us that feedback saying, hey, this is what happened. And closing that feedback loop was very, very important, because that gave us the really rich data about the context, about what actually happened in this case, right? Obviously, false positives and true positives, both cases. False negatives are hard. If you missed a collision, how do you know you missed one in the real world, right? And so that is where we created something interesting. We basically said, hey, for our customers, we will tell at this level or at this threshold that there is a collision, but we will detect things that are even well below that, where there are likely to be many more false positives, but hidden in there may be many more false negatives as well. And we'll collect that data. And we spun up an analytics team, a bunch of analysts just sitting and looking at the data day in and day out, and trying to figure out whether a certain data that was recorded, because we don't have a user feedback about this. We never surfaced this to the user, but now we want to know whether this is a collision or not. So then you start figuring out all kinds of interesting circumstantial evidence. What happened in this? Where did the collision happen? Was this Typically where the user strip ends, no, maybe not. He just applied a hard brake at the end of it and something happened, and that's not a collision. Or no, this happened smack in the middle of a highway. And the car stopped there for 2 hours. Seems like a collision. Oh, the next trip after this ended up in a hospital. It's definitely a collision. The next trip ended in an auto body. Yeah, it was a property damage kind of a collision. Maybe somebody wasn't hurt. So you start getting sort of all of these kinds of interesting soft labels through these kind of analysis. And this is all really messy, ugly work to some extent, but all of this is required to sort of build a product at the end of the day, right? So we did all that. Over last several years, sort of we ended up building a repository of 100,000 plus validated collisions, and that we believe today is the single largest repository of such data out there. Even if you look at car manufacturers, they rarely have this volume of data because their data comes from crash tests within the labs. It's in a very controlled environment. So the real world, what's happening out there kind of data is something that we have. And that becomes in some ways a big asset, a big moat for any solution that you want to build from there on. So that's the data part. Let's talk about the algorithmic improvements that we brought in along with it, right? So what matters in this case? In several problems, sort of trade-off between false positives and false negatives is somewhat obvious. In this case, it's a very complex trade-off, right? If you have too many false positives, it's like crying wolf. People will get frustrated with the product that you have, you will lose your credibility. If you have false negatives, somebody who could have actually been helped and life could have been saved, you have not done your job correctly. So it's a very complex, very difficult trade-off to make, and sort of that's one thing that we have constantly kept on tweaking and improving over time. Of course, with larger data sets, sort of we could apply interesting and more sophisticated machine learning techniques. As I mentioned, the first versions were more heuristic driven. The later versions of algorithms have been much more machine learning driven. So things like we started modeling how much energy is getting dissipated when an impact is happening, because we found some interesting differences between a true collision impact and a false positive kind of impact, and then we could use sort of energies, that kind of energy density to understand differences between false positives and false negatives and true positives. I talked about sort of building these evidences about what was happening before the crash, during the crash, and after the crash. Initially, some of these were heuristics. Later, we started building specific machine learning algorithms for each of this. What kind of what is the direction of impact, for example, that we are seeing in the car, based on the car's motion and the accelerometer that we have seen. What is the kind of for example, like stopping distance. How long does it take for the vehicle, whatever speed it was traveling, to come to a full stop? And does that give an indication of whether it is a crash or it is just a hard brake at the end of it? We started computing features at various levels, and sort of this was again intuition based on sort of analysis of the data, but then we started building various models that applied wavelets, different types of wavelets essentially, to extract features at different time scales, and use those features in our eventual model. And finally, even for the combining model, it evolved from sort of a voting based approach to a much more sort of nonlinear combination at multiple levels. So a lot of innovation and a lot of improvements at the algorithmic level as well, but it's a combination of data, human ingenuity, as well as sort of algorithms that are sort of being able to do that at the end of it. And then finally, continuous testing and validation. There is just no substitute to doing that. So I'll show you probably a few examples of some of the tests. Let's talk about this. Let's see.
ZENDRIVE, we're here at sunny Atenanto. This is Cargo Engineering Facility, and we came here to do crash tests in order to test ZENDRIVE's technology and see how accurate we are to register crashes in the real world. So we put 16 phones in the car, 8 Androids and 8 iOS. This would be a successful test if all our phones would actually register the crash and if everyone is alive and happy at the end. So that just happened, and now we're going to see if our phones detected a collision. This one is from the front door, and ZENDRIVE has detected collision. And collision detected. Collision detected. We had 15 phones out of 16 that detected a collision, and only one that didn't because it got completely destroyed. So mission accomplished.
So we keep doing these kinds of interesting sort of tests all the time. I'll probably take a couple more minutes and then I'm actually done. Let's quickly talk about sort of where we have landed at the end of this. Today we are at 90+% detection rate for all collisions that happen over 20 miles an hour, just using smartphones. Right? And it works across all different types of smartphones that you can imagine. False positives. Typically we talked about a collision happening every 500,000 miles today, and this is the graph that's showing sort of as we kept on increasing the number of miles of data and number of collisions that we have seen and improving techniques, how the false positive rate measured on number of false positives per million miles has kept on dropping. And you can see sort of both Android and iOS are sort of below 1 false positive every 5 million miles or sort of less. So that's sort of the level of sophistication that these algorithms have achieved at this stage. And with that, I will leave you guys with sort of just another quick video about why are we doing it, all of this to begin with.
Passengers, we think about safety. At ZENDRIVE, we're on a mission. We believe that if someone's in a car crash, whether you're in your own car or someone else's car, emergency responders and loved ones who you specify in advance should be notified immediately. Join us in making the roads safer. ZENDRIVE, making roads safer through data and analytics. When we think about drivers and passengers, we think about.
Right, thank you so much. If there are more questions, happy to take those on. Yes.
Which energy are you talking about and how do you measure?
So if you look at the sensor data that's coming in, it's a time series data at the end of it, right? You're looking at the 3-axis accelerometer data that you are seeing. You're also looking at the gyroscope data, which you can use to sort of rotate the phone axis or phone frame information back to the car axis, and then you are looking at the energy of the impact that actually happened. And if you look at the total amount of energy that got dissipated during the impact, we found that to be a very interesting indicator, or rather a discriminator between the true positives and false positives.
Any other questions?
Yes.
The kind of data that you can collect from smartphone versus the onboard sensors.
Mm-hmm.
Can you let something else?
Sure, absolutely. This was the very first question that was asked to us from any VC, right? You were talking about difficult questions, yes. No, so that was in fact the very first analysis that we did. We actually collaborated with University of Illinois, Professor Romit Roy Chaudhary, and actually did a lot of analysis of what OBD, onboard diagnostic data gives and what the smartphone sensor gives, and sort of how correlated they are. And actually there is a white paper you can get from ZENDRIVE website that basically sort of was written by researchers at IISc that talks about how smartphone data is 98% correlated with the OBD data. So that was the first basic thing that we established before building any of this stuff. Yes.
So,
yes, there are always those possibilities, right? But these days people forget their children at home, not their phones. So, so I'm less worried about that one.
So I have one question. In future, if collision avoidance systems get better,
Yes.
will it make this obsolete?
If lives are saved, that's great. It's wonderful, right? I mean, I'm a true believer in autonomous cars. So yeah. Yes, we have some early thoughts about that as well. Not ready for a talk yet. Yes. Yes. But most drivers don't want surveillance cameras pointed at them or even anywhere in the car, right? Sorry? Yes. Oh, absolutely. Look, there are definitely these, infrastructure level enhancements, right? Having sensors on the roads, having sensors, cameras at every intersection. All of those things are great initiatives, and we absolutely sort of, support and love them. But what we see happening in the real world is any kind of hardware adoption is a much, much slower adoption. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of investment to begin with. The solution that ZENDRIVE has focused on is something that can be readily deployed today and has been deployed at a very large scale already, right? So we are a platform. We provide this technology to our customers. So we are a B2B company at the end of the day. We don't provide an application, but rather our customers include, companies that work in family safety, companies on roadside assistance side, companies that have large fleets and want to monitor and measure their drivers, companies, insurance companies, and so on. So, insurance is a huge usage-based insurance is a huge thing. Yeah. Slow. Yes.
So in case you need more qualified data, feel free to reach out to me. Routematic. I have access to 20,000 drivers driving every day, and the collision rate is going to be far better than what you can get in.
Not a good thing, but I would definitely love to.
No, on a serious note, is it restricted only to hard collisions, or do you also, because we are into similar research?
Anything above 20 mph we are detecting.
20 mph is because
and we are looking at reducing that. We are already.
So we are currently working on, for example, we are about 80-85% accurate on heating a speed breaker or taking a pothole using only the linear accelerometer.
That's fantastic.
Right. So the idea is, whether he was hitting, getting into these events at a speed, right? Correct. So it is a mixture of GPS and accelerometer, preferably gyroscope as well.
Correct.
Right? So that kind of data is what we are looking at.
Would love to learn more.
And like I said, have access to a lot of data, a lot of collisions, more than you can imagine.
Fantastic. Any last questions? Yes.
Because the more of driver's emotions, right? So is there any way that you capture that, or is it only sensors data?
Sadly, no today. There you go. Yeah, we are not looking at the emotions of the drivers themselves. If they had a fight with their wife today. All right, thank you so much, guys.